The moment the child was born, the hospital room grew silent. The nurse's hands trembled as she wrapped the baby in a soft, white blanket. The baby's face, if it could even be called that, was a horrific sight. His skin was an unnatural shade of gray, and his eyes, wide and glassy, gleamed with an otherworldly light. But it wasn't just his skin or his eyes that sent shivers down everyone's spine, it was the structure of his face itself. His features were mismatched, as if his face had been formed without any regard for symmetry. The mother, still dazed from the delivery, struggled to focus. She had dreamed of holding her baby, of bringing a beautiful life into the world, but what she saw before her now was a nightmare. Tears welled up in her eyes, not out of joy, but out of fear. She couldn't fathom what had gone wrong. Her husband stood in the corner, his face ashen as he slowly sank into a chair. Neither of them had the courage to hold the child. Is he, the mother whispered, unable to finish the question. The nurse, too stunned to speak, simply shook her head. There was no easy answer. They had both known something was off during the pregnancy. The doctor had assured them it was just a complication, something that would be corrected after birth. But now, in this moment, as the baby gazed up at them with those unsettling, unblinking eyes, it was clear that nothing could fix this. It didn't take long for the decision to be made. The mother, feeling a deep well of sorrow but unable to overcome her fear, looked at her husband, who was still frozen, unable to speak. There was a look in his eyes, something deep and cold, as if he had already resigned himself to the idea that this was not a child they could keep. The doctor, who had been standing silently at the doorway, cleared his throat. Perhaps it would be best if you didn't make any hasty decisions. You may want to think this over, the doctor said, his voice gentle, but there was no hiding the look of discomfort in his eyes. The mother looked up at him, her face crumpling with emotion. She wanted to believe there was still hope, but the sight of her newborn only deepened her fear. It was the fear of the unknown, of what kind of life this child would lead, and more so, what kind of life they could offer him. Hours passed, and the weight of the decision began to grow unbearable. They both knew that abandoning the child was wrong, but the thought of raising a child so different, so alien to their world, was more than they could handle. And in that darkness, that raw fear, they made a choice that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The baby was taken to a nearby orphanage, a place that took in children with no one else to care for them. The nurses there were kind, but even they couldn't hide the shock when they saw the child. There was no official explanation given to the staff. The parents left in the dead of night, without a word to anyone, without a look back. They left behind a child they couldn't love, couldn't understand, a child whose appearance defied all logic. In the days that followed, word spread about the mysterious baby left at the orphanage. But the rumors only fueled the mystery, as no one could figure out where the child had come from. Was he the result of some experiment? Was he a child of unknown origins? The authorities didn't even know how to classify him. As months passed, the baby grew, but he remained an enigma, unlike any child the world had ever seen. He seemed perfectly normal, aside from his strange appearance. He had an uncanny calmness, a presence that felt unnatural. Meanwhile, far from the quiet orphanage, the parents lived with the weight of their decision. The days turned into weeks, then months, then years. Their guilt grew. They had abandoned their own flesh and blood, left him to be raised by strangers, and for what? Fear? Discomfort? Regret? But the decision they had made that night, the night they turned their backs on their child, was only the beginning of a journey that would forever alter the course of their lives, and the life of the child they abandoned. Somewhere far away, a renowned doctor had heard whispers of the strange child. And he was determined to find out who this boy truly was. Years passed since the child had been abandoned, and life for him at the orphanage continued as if it were just another part of the world's forgotten stories. But for Dr. Thomas Green, the baby's existence had never faded from his mind. Dr. Green was a renowned expert in genetic research, a man obsessed with the limits of human biology. But the mystery of the child with the strange, unexplainable features captured his imagination in a way that no scientific case ever had. It started as a passing mention during a medical conference. A colleague had casually mentioned hearing about a child abandoned by his parents because of his unusual appearance. The description was vague, but it didn't matter. Dr. Green was hooked. For weeks, he couldn't shake the thought of that baby. What had happened to him? Where had he gone? Why had his parents left him? There was something in the back of his mind, a quiet whisper telling him that this child might be the key to answering questions he had spent his entire life investigating. Theories of human evolution, undiscovered medical conditions, even extraterrestrial possibilities, all of it seemed connected to that strange, gray-faced baby. Dr. Green's obsession grew, and soon it was no longer a passing interest. He found every possible lead he could on the orphanage where the child had been left. His search took him to obscure medical journals, underground networks of genetic scientists, and even rumors of secret research projects. The further he dug, the more questions piled up. Why hadn't anyone known who the child's parents were? Why had they abandoned him without a trace? What had caused his abnormal features, his otherworldly look? These questions tormented him. Late one evening, while alone in his study, Dr. Green stumbled upon an old, obscure document in a forgotten archive. The report detailed the discovery of an unusual set of genetic markers found in a small group of people scattered across the world. These markers were rare, too rare to be coincidental, and their genetic makeup resembled something beyond ordinary human biology. Dr. Green's heart raced as he read further. Could this child, this mysterious baby, be connected to this long-forgotten lineage? The doctor felt a fire of excitement, but also fear. If this baby was indeed part of something far bigger than anyone could imagine, then what did that mean for the world? What kind of power or knowledge might be buried inside him? Determined to find answers, Dr. Green made the decision to track down the child. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he was certain that this journey would unlock secrets that had been hidden for centuries. The boy, now a young child, had likely grown up under the radar, unnoticed by the wider world. The orphanage kept records, but they were sparse, just enough to prove that this child was, indeed, a part of the larger mystery. Weeks turned into months as Dr. Green traveled across the country, visiting orphanages, tracing old records, and following whispered leads. He encountered resistance from some officials who were wary of his questions, but he never gave up. His research led him to a small, remote town where the child had been placed in foster care after his time in the orphanage. The closer Dr. Green got to the child, the more uneasy he felt. He knew this wasn't just a simple case of an abandoned child, this was something much larger. Every instinct in him told him that the boy had been born for a reason, and that reason was tied to something no one had anticipated. When he finally arrived at the foster family's house, he was met with the first clear details of the child's life. The boy's name, his development, his odd behavior, it all painted a picture of something extraordinary. But what could Dr. Green do with this knowledge? Would the boy even want to know what he was? He decided that there was no turning back. The boy would need to know the truth, and Dr. Green was the one who would have to tell him. But what if the boy's life had already been changed by the abandonment? What if the child didn't want anything to do with the world that had left him behind? Dr. Green knocked on the door of the foster home, feeling the weight of his decision press down on him. The answers he sought could change everything, but the cost might be greater than he imagined. The door creaked open slowly, and a woman in her late 50s appeared. She was small, her face lined with the years of caring for children who had come and gone, each leaving a mark in her heart. Her eyes, however, were sharp, and there was a sense of quiet strength in her gaze. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious but not unfriendly. Dr. Green cleared his throat, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. "I'm looking for a boy named Khalil," he said, using the name he had uncovered during his research. The name was unfamiliar, but he hoped it would strike a chord with the foster mother. Her expression softened, but there was something in her eyes that told him she had heard the name too many times. Khalil, she repeated, almost wistfully. He's not here right now. He's out playing with the other kids. But you can come in and wait if you like. Dr. Green nodded and stepped inside. The modest home was filled with the warmth of a busy household, the sounds of laughter and the bustle of children's activities. The walls were decorated with old family photographs and drawings, and there was an old wood stove that crackled gently in the corner. The foster mother led him to a small living room, where they sat in silence for a few minutes. Dr. Green's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. Khalil had grown up here, away from the horrors of his first abandonment. He had a life now, but what kind of life? Would this boy, now 10 years old, understand what Dr. Green was about to tell him? Could he even comprehend it? Soon enough, the sounds of children outside faded, and Khalil entered the room. Dr. Green's breath caught in his throat when he saw him. Khalil's appearance was still striking. His features had softened with age, but the uniqueness of his face was still there, just as it had been described all those years ago. He had a deep, almost otherworldly stillness to him, like he was carrying the weight of the world even though he was just a child. His eyes, too, were just as unsettling, bright and almost luminous, as though they could see into things others couldn't. Khalil's gaze fixed on Dr. Green, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt charged with anticipation, as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. Finally, the boy broke the silence. "Who are you?" he asked in a calm, measured tone. "My name is Dr. Thomas Green," the doctor said, standing up. "I've come because I believe you have something very special about you, Khalil. Something that I need to understand." Khalil tilted his head slightly, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean by special?" Dr. Green hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I believe you are not like other children. Your appearance, your abilities, they're unlike anything I've seen in all my years of study." Khalil's expression didn't change, but the faintest hint of discomfort crossed his face. "I don't understand. I'm just a normal kid." "No, Khalil," Dr. Green said, his voice gentle but firm. "You are far from normal. Your genetic makeup is unlike anyone else's. Your parents left you because they were afraid, but the truth is, you were born for something much greater." The boy's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Dr. Green felt a shiver of uncertainty. He had prepared himself for this moment, but standing here, looking into the boy's eyes, he wasn't so sure anymore. Could he really explain this to a child? Was he ready to hear it? "I've been researching something for years," Dr. Green continued. "Something that has been hidden for centuries. There's a group of people, a very old lineage, who share your genetic markers. These markers suggest something extraordinary." Khalil stood silently for a moment, taking in the doctor's words. Then, as if a switch had flipped, he turned and walked toward the door. "I don't care about any of that," he said quietly. "I'm just a kid, and I've got a life to live." Dr. Green stood frozen, watching the boy. His heart pounded in his chest. The doctor had expected resistance, but this? This was more than he had bargained for. The boy was so much more than just an enigma. He was real. He was here, and yet, he wanted nothing to do with the truth. But Dr. Green wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "Khalil, please. Just listen," he said, his voice almost pleading. "The world doesn't know about you. You're special, and that means you have a choice. A choice to either hide who you are, or to embrace it and change the course of everything." Khalil stopped, turning to face Dr. Green once more. "I don't know what you want from me," he said, his voice now tinged with a deep sadness. I don't want to be different. I don't want to be some experiment or whatever you think I am. I just want to be normal. Dar. Green's heart sank as he saw the boy's pain. This wasn't just a scientific discovery. This was a real person, with feelings, fears, and hopes. He had thought the boy might want to learn about his origins, but he hadn't expected the depth of Khalil's resistance. Could the boy ever accept his place in the world? Could anyone? The moment hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. Dr. Green's mind raced, trying to figure out the next step. But for now, all he could do was wait. Khalil's journey had only just begun, and so, it seemed, had Dr. Green's. As the years slipped by, the once bold decision to abandon Khalil weighed heavily on his parents. It had been a choice made in the heat of fear, in the moments of panic and uncertainty after his birth. They had been scared, terrified even, of what they didn't understand. But now, years later, as they lived in their quiet suburban home, the echoes of that decision haunted them. It started with small things, the way they'd avoid looking at the family photos, the way they would change the subject when someone brought up children. They never talked about the day they left Khalil, but it was always there, a shadow that loomed over every conversation. The guilt was subtle at first, like a drip of water slowly eroding the foundation of their lives, but over time, it grew unbearable. The mother, once so certain in her decision, found herself staring at the crib of their youngest child, a perfectly healthy baby girl, with a kind of hollow longing. What if, the thought never fully formed, but it didn't need to. The guilt was too much to bear, and the what ifs were enough to fill her nights with restless dreams. The father, too, had changed. He would often look at their house and think about the child they had abandoned so long ago, wondering what Khalil might have become had they kept him. They had tried to move on, tried to bury the pain deep inside, but the memories never truly left. They were always there, resurfacing at the most unexpected times. The mother even started visiting orphanages, hoping for some sign that Khalil was still out there, that he hadn't been lost forever. But with every visit, with every fruitless search, the realization that they might never find him settled deeper in her heart. It wasn't until the letter came that everything changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the letter arrived. The envelope was thick, and the handwriting on the front was unfamiliar. The father held it in his hands for a long moment before he opened it. The moment he began to read, his face went pale. The letter was short, but the words were enough to send his heart racing. "We have found your son. His name is Khalil. He is alive, and he needs your help. I suggest you come quickly." The words in that letter were a shock to the parents, like a jolt of electricity that ran through their bodies. Their son, alive? After all these years, the boy they had abandoned was still out there? They sat together in silence, the weight of the past crashing down on them. They had thought they would never see him again, but now, the truth was impossible to ignore. Khalil was alive, and he had been searching for answers, answers that might change everything they thought they knew about their son. For the first time in years, they felt something they had long since forgotten: hope. The father set down the letter, his hands shaking. "We have to go to him," he said, his voice low and unsure. The mother stared at the letter, unable to speak at first. "But what if he doesn't want us? After everything we did, after the way we abandoned him, what if he's angry with us?" Her voice cracked with emotion. It was a fear she couldn't shake, a fear that had gnawed at her for years. The father didn't answer immediately. He simply stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the familiar street. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the soft click of a clock ticking in the corner. But all he could think about was Khalil. Was he angry? Did he hate them for what they'd done? Was he even the same boy they had abandoned, or had time and pain turned him into someone unrecognizable? "We won't know until we try," he said, his voice firm. There was no more time for doubts. They had wasted enough time already. They packed quickly, taking only what they needed. The journey ahead was uncertain, but the thought of their son, alive and searching for them, was enough to fuel their determination. The parents had no idea what awaited them, but they knew one thing for certain: they had to make things right, no matter what it took. As they drove, their minds swirled with questions, with regrets, with hopes. But deep inside, they knew that this was a second chance. A chance to heal the wounds of the past. A chance to face the son they had left behind and make amends for everything they had done wrong. They had no idea that the boy they had abandoned all those years ago had changed, and that the truth about who he was, about the very essence of his being, was something neither they nor Dr. Green could have ever anticipated. Khalil had always known he was different. From an early age, he had felt the weight of his uniqueness. It wasn't just his face, though, that had certainly set him apart. It was the way people reacted to him, the way he could feel their fear and curiosity seeping through their expressions. He knew there was something in him that others didn't understand, something that made them look at him like he wasn't supposed to exist. But despite the stares, despite the whispers and the isolation, Khalil had learned to embrace his difference. The children in the foster home had been kind to him, though some kept their distance. He never blamed them. He understood. After all, what could they see when they looked at him? A child who didn't fit into the world, who didn't look like anyone else they knew. And yet, despite it all, Khalil had grown up with a quiet strength. He didn't care what the world thought of him. He had his own world, and in it, he was enough. His abilities, however, were something he had kept to himself. They were subtle at first, small things, like sensing someone's emotions before they even spoke, or hearing things from a distance that others couldn't. It wasn't until he was about 7 that the full extent of his powers began to show. The first time it happened, he had been playing outside, his mind wandering, when he suddenly found himself able to move objects without touching them. A small rock floated in the air before him, turning slowly as if it were caught in some invisible current. Khalil was terrified. He had always known something was different, but this? This was beyond anything he had ever imagined. He hadn't told anyone about his abilities. The foster family, while loving, wouldn't understand. And besides, he wasn't sure what to make of it himself. He kept his strange gifts a secret, burying them deep inside, as if by doing so, he could make them go away. But they didn't go away. As he grew, so did his powers. He could hear thoughts sometimes, especially when people were close to him. He could feel things, see things, know things. It was overwhelming, yet exhilarating. Khalil could control most of it, but there were times when his abilities surged, when they threatened to take over, when he would lose himself in the chaos of it all. And so, he kept to himself. He studied in silence, trying to understand what he was becoming, what he had always been. But despite his isolation, there was a nagging feeling deep inside, something telling him that there was more to his story. His parents, his real parents, had left him. That much, he knew. But why? What had they seen in him that made them turn away? It was a question that burned in his mind, one that never seemed to have an answer. Until one day, the doctor showed up. Dr. Green's arrival had been both expected and unexpected. Khalil had been warned by the foster family that someone would be coming, a man who had been asking about him for months. At first, Khalil hadn't known what to think. Why would anyone care about him? He was just a boy, a strange boy with a past he didn't understand. But when the doctor arrived, everything changed. The moment their eyes met, something clicked inside Khalil. There was a familiarity in the doctor's gaze, a quiet understanding that made Khalil feel like he wasn't alone anymore. And as the doctor spoke, revealing bits and pieces of the truth about Khalil's origins, something inside the boy stirred. His mother and father, those faces that had never truly left his mind, suddenly became more than just figments of a distant memory. They were real. They were out there. And they wanted him back. Dr. Green had told him everything, the secrets hidden in his blood, the lineage he came from, the extraordinary power that flowed through his veins. But it wasn't just the science or the mystery that made Khalil's heart race. It was the possibility of something more, something he had always longed for, the chance to finally understand who he was. But understanding wasn't the same as acceptance. The truth of what he was, that he wasn't just a boy, but something more, terrified him. Was he a freak? Was he a weapon? His mind raced with the possibilities, the unknowns that had once felt like distant fears, now all too real. And so, he retreated. The doctor had come with the answers Khalil had always wanted, but they weren't easy answers. They were a burden, a weight that Khalil didn't know how to carry. The thought of seeing his parents, of meeting them after all these years, filled him with both hope and dread. What would they say? Would they accept him? Or would they, too, turn away from the boy who was different, who was special, who was more than human? As he sat alone in his room that night, looking out over the quiet town, Khalil felt a stirring deep within him. The decision had been made. He had to face the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. He had to meet his parents. He had to learn who he really was. And perhaps, in doing so, he would find his place in the world, not as an outcast, but as someone who was meant to be here. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a journey that Khalil could no longer avoid. He was ready to face his past, to confront the unknown, and to take the first step toward a future he had never dared to imagine. The day had come. Khalil stood at the threshold of the unknown, a sense of anxiety churning in his stomach. It had been years since he had first been abandoned, and now, his biological parents were on their way to meet him. He had spent countless nights wondering what it would be like to finally see them again, but now, as the time drew near, the reality of the situation settled in. What would they say? Would they look at him as the son they once left behind, or would they embrace him as someone new, someone they didn't understand? The foster parents, though kind and supportive, could sense the turmoil within him. They had watched Khalil grow, witnessing his inner conflict and the quiet strength he carried despite his isolation. Now, as the moment approached, they too felt a mix of hope and fear. The boy they had cared for all these years, who had been nothing but kind to them, despite the strange abilities that set him apart, was about to meet the people who had given him life. What would that reunion be like? Dr. Green, who had orchestrated this meeting, was also present, though his role was unclear to Khalil. The doctor had told him that he had spent years researching his condition, his genetics, his extraordinary abilities. But Khalil wasn't sure if the doctor's intentions were pure. Was he just a tool for Dr. Green to study, to uncover the secrets hidden within his blood? Or was the doctor a friend, someone who had truly wanted to help him understand who he was? Khalil glanced at Dr. Green, who stood in the corner of the room, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure about this?" Khalil asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. Dr. Green met his gaze, his eyes softening for a moment. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You deserve to know who you are, Khalil. Your parents need to see you for who you've become." Khalil wasn't so sure. The weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. For so long, he had hidden from the truth, buried it deep within himself, afraid to confront the past. But here it was, staring him in the face. There was a knock at the door. It was quiet at first, a hesitant tap, but it echoed in the silence of the room. Khalil felt his heart race. This was it. This was the moment that could change everything. The foster mother opened the door, revealing two figures standing in the hallway. Khalil's breath caught in his throat as he saw them, his parents. The faces he had dreamed of seeing for so long were now before him, but they looked older, worn by time, regret, and guilt. His mother's eyes were filled with unspeakable sorrow, and his father's face was ashen, as if he had carried the burden of their past decision for far too long. The moment they stepped inside, there was a heavy silence. Khalil didn't know what to say. His parents stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure of how to approach him. He felt a sharp pang of hurt in his chest, mixed with confusion. He wanted to run, to hide from this moment, but he couldn't. His mother spoke first, her voice breaking as she took a hesitant step forward. "Khalil," she whispered, as if afraid to say his name aloud. We never meant to hurt you. We were afraid. We didn't know what to do. We made a terrible mistake." Khalil didn't speak right away. His eyes never left hers. He wanted to say something, to let them know how much their abandonment had hurt him, how it had shaped the person he had become. But the words didn't come. Instead, he felt a strange pull in his chest, a mix of anger, confusion, and something else. Something he couldn't quite name. His father took a deep breath and stepped forward, his voice low but filled with remorse. "Khalil, I know we don't deserve your forgiveness. I know what we did to you was unforgivable. But we never stopped thinking about you. Every day, we regretted leaving you. We've searched for you all these years, and now that we found you, we want to make things right." Khalil's heart ached. Part of him wanted to yell at them, to tell them how they had ruined his life, how their decision had left a permanent scar on his soul. But as he looked at them, his mother, her eyes pleading for forgiveness, his father's face full of shame, he realized something that shocked him to the core. They were human. They were flawed. They had made a terrible mistake, but they were still his parents. "Why did you leave me?" Khalil asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you try to fix it? Why didn't you try to understand?" His mother's eyes welled with tears as she stepped closer to him. "We were afraid, Khalil. We didn't know what to do. We thought we were protecting you by giving you up, by letting someone else take care of you. But we were wrong. We were so wrong." There was a long pause. Khalil could feel the weight of their words sinking in. Part of him wanted to run away from them, to stay in the safe distance he had built around himself for so long. But another part of him, one he hadn't let speak in years, wanted to reach out, to let them in. Do you want to know me?" Khalil asked, his voice trembling. The question hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. It wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about something deeper. Could they accept him as he was, strange and different, or would they only see him as the boy they had abandoned? His father reached out, his hand shaking slightly as he placed it on Khalil's shoulder. "We want to know you. We want to be part of your life, if you'll let us." Khalil didn't answer immediately. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. He had spent so many years trying to figure out who he was, and now, here were his parents, offering a chance at redemption. But the choice was his. Could he let them back into his life? Could he forgive them for the pain they had caused? For the first time in his life, Khalil felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe, just maybe, he could find peace, not just with his parents, but with himself. The journey was far from over, but this moment, this reunion, had the power to change everything. Khalil sat in silence, the weight of his parents' words still echoing in his mind. The quiet hum of the room, the sound of the clock ticking in the corner, seemed so distant now, as though everything around him was paused in time. His parents, his real parents, were here, in front of him, after all these years. The emotions inside him swirled like a storm, anger, confusion, hope, and fear, all tangled together. He had spent his whole life believing he was different, believing he didn't belong. He had learned to live with the loneliness, to embrace his difference as a part of who he was. And now, suddenly, everything was changing. His past, the abandonment, the fear, it was all being brought back to the surface, and he didn't know how to process it. What now? Khalil asked, his voice quiet, but the question was loaded with meaning. What was he supposed to do with this new reality? His parents wanted to make things right, but could they? Could he? His mother looked at him, her eyes filled with an overwhelming mixture of guilt and love. "We don't have any answers, Khalil," she said softly. "We can't undo the past, but we can try to make up for it. We want to be part of your life. If you'll let us." Khalil's eyes narrowed slightly. "But what if I don't want you in my life?" The words came out before he could stop them. His heart thudded in his chest, and he instantly regretted the harshness in his voice. He didn't mean to hurt them, but he didn't know how else to express what he was feeling. "What if I don't want to forgive you? What if everything you did hurt me too much?" There it was, the truth that had been buried inside him for so long. The pain of being abandoned, the fear that came with being different, the years of uncertainty. How could he just forget all of that and let them back in? How could he erase the scar they had left on his heart? His father's voice trembled as he spoke, his hand still resting on Khalil's shoulder. "We understand that, Khalil. We know we can't expect you to forgive us right away. But we want you to know that we're here for you. We'll do whatever it takes to make things right. If you can't forgive us now, we'll wait. We've waited all these years. We can wait as long as it takes." Khalil felt the truth in his father's words, but it didn't make it any easier. He wanted to be angry, to yell at them for what they had done, but part of him knew they were right. They had made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but they were trying now. They were trying to fix it. Dr. Green, who had remained silent through most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "Khalil, you don't have to make a decision today. You don't have to forgive them right away. But what I've seen in you, the strength, the courage you've shown in the face of everything that's happened to you, it's extraordinary. You've already made it this far, and now, you have the power to decide what comes next. You don't have to be defined by your past, but you do have the power to shape your future." The doctor's words rang true, but they also made Khalil's heart ache. He had spent so much of his life running from the truth, running from the reality of who he was. But now, the truth was staring him in the face, and he had to decide what to do with it. For the first time in his life, Khalil understood that he didn't have to choose between who he was and who his parents wanted him to be. He could be both. He could forgive them, if he wanted to, but he didn't have to forget the pain. He could choose his own path, and that path could include them, if he was ready. There was a quiet moment, a stillness that settled over the room as Khalil wrestled with his thoughts. His parents were waiting for him to make a decision, but they weren't rushing him. They understood. They knew that this was something he needed to do on his own, in his own time. "I don't know what to do," Khalil said finally, his voice low. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I don't want to stay angry forever either. I've carried this anger with me for so long. Maybe I just need time." His mother nodded, her face softening with understanding. "We'll give you as much time as you need, Khalil. We're not going anywhere." Khalil took a deep breath and looked out the window, his mind racing. This was the hardest thing he had ever done. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of possibility. He didn't have to carry the weight of his past alone anymore. He didn't have to be defined by what had happened to him. He could be more than his abandonment, more than the pain. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, he was no longer just the boy they had abandoned. He was Khalil, someone with a past, with powers, with a future. And he was ready to begin the next chapter of his life, no matter how uncertain or difficult it might be. As the sun began to set outside, casting a warm glow over the room, Khalil finally looked back at his parents. "I'll need time," he said again, his voice more certain now. "But I think I'm ready to try." It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the first step toward healing. And for Khalil, that was enough. Khalil's decision, though a step toward healing, was not an easy one. The road ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty. His parents, though understanding and patient, were a part of his past that he wasn't sure how to reconcile with the person he had become. But he knew one thing for sure: facing the truth was the only way forward. There was no going back to the boy who hid in the shadows of his own fear. In the days that followed the reunion, Khalil spent a lot of time thinking. His mind was a storm of thoughts, about his parents, his abilities, his past, and, more, about what Dr. Green had said. You don't have to be defined by your past, the doctor had told him. But every time Khalil tried to imagine a future, he couldn't help but wonder, could he ever truly leave the past behind? Meanwhile, the world around him seemed to shift in subtle ways. It wasn't just his family dynamic that was changing. Khalil could feel it in the air, the strange energy that seemed to hum at the edges of his awareness, like something waiting to happen. The abilities he had kept hidden for so long were becoming harder to control. The whispers of thoughts from others were louder, more insistent. His powers, once something he could manage, were now pushing the limits of what he could comprehend. Dr. Green, though kind and patient, was relentless in his pursuit of understanding. He believed Khalil was more than just a child with strange abilities. He believed that Khalil was part of something much greater, something that had been hidden from the world for centuries. And Dr. Green wasn't the only one interested in the boy's power. The whispers had begun again. This time, they weren't just about the boy's unique abilities, they were about what Khalil represented. A group of powerful individuals, with unknown motives, had begun to take notice of Khalil's existence. They had been watching him from the shadows, waiting for the moment when his powers would reveal themselves fully. One evening, as Khalil sat in the quiet of his room, trying to focus on the thoughts he could hear and control, he felt it, a sudden surge of power, one he couldn't contain. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, and for a moment, he felt like everything around him was about to explode. He reached out instinctively, trying to calm the surge, but it was too strong. His body shook as the energy built inside him, threatening to burst. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the power faded. Khalil stood frozen, breathing heavily, his heart pounding. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with fear. What had just happened? He knew, deep down, that he couldn't keep this under control forever. His abilities were growing stronger, and the consequences of not learning how to harness them were terrifying. But just as the weight of his powers seemed unbearable, there was a knock at the door. It was Dr. Green. "Everything all right?" the doctor asked, stepping into the room. He looked concerned, as if he already knew something was wrong. I don't know," Khalil muttered, his voice unsteady. "I can't control it. My powers, they're growing. I don't understand why." Dr. Green approached him slowly, his expression sympathetic. "It's all right. You're not alone in this, Khalil. These abilities, this power, you're not the first one to experience them. And you won't be the last." Khalil looked up at him, his eyes wide with confusion. "What do you mean? What's happening to me? What am I supposed to do?" Dr. Green paused, his gaze shifting to the window, as if weighing his words carefully. "You're part of something much larger than you can imagine. Your abilities, they're tied to an ancient bloodline, one that has been hidden for centuries. Your ancestors were beings of great power, beings who were entrusted with knowledge that could change the world. But that power has always been dangerous. And now, it's waking up inside you." Khalil's breath caught in his throat. "You mean, I'm not just different because of my looks? There's more to it than that?" Dr. Green nodded. "Yes. Your power, your genetic makeup, it's all part of a lineage that was meant to stay hidden. But now, that secrecy is being threatened. And there are people, powerful people, who want to control that power for themselves." The gravity of Dr. Green's words sank in. Khalil felt the weight of everything. The past, his powers, his parents' abandonment, the mysterious forces that were now after him. It was all connected, and the more he learned, the more he realized that the stakes were much higher than he could have ever imagined. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed open. Khalil turned to see two figures standing in the doorway, men dressed in dark suits, their faces shadowed. Khalil's heart raced. He could feel their presence, a cold, calculated energy that sent chills down his spine. These were not ordinary people. Dr. Green stepped in front of Khalil protectively. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady but tinged with fear. "We've come for him," one of the men said, his voice low and menacing. "He's not just a boy. He's a key. And we're taking him." Khalil's stomach twisted with fear. The room seemed to grow colder, and the energy inside him surged again, almost uncontrollably. His eyes widened as he realized that the confrontation had begun. The men moved toward him, but Khalil didn't wait. He didn't know what was happening, but instinct took over. His powers exploded, a wave of force that sent the men flying back against the walls. For a moment, everything was still. Khalil stood there, breathing heavily, his heart racing, as the dust settled around him. The two men were unconscious, crumpled on the floor. Khalil's mind was reeling. What had just happened? Had he done this? Dr. Green looked at him in awe, his face a mix of concern and wonder. "You did it, Khalil. You're beginning to understand your power. But this is only the beginning. You've got to learn how to control it, before it controls you." Khalil stared at the men on the floor, his breath steadying. He had just defended himself, but at what cost? What kind of world had he just stepped into? The consequences were clear now. This wasn't just about him or his parents anymore. It was about something much larger, a power that had the potential to change everything. And Khalil was at the center of it all. Khalil sat alone, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, the gravity of everything he had just learned weighing heavily on his chest. His powers, the forces that now stirred within him, were not only a gift, they were a responsibility. And not just any responsibility, but one that carried the weight of an entire legacy, an ancient lineage that had been hidden for centuries. The two men who had come to take him were not the first, and they wouldn't be the last. Khalil knew that now. There were others, shadowy figures who were willing to do anything to control the power he held within him. But how could he fight something so vast, so deeply entrenched in history? He was just one boy, one with a face that had once been feared and abandoned. How could he face the world when it demanded so much from him? Dr. Green had stayed by his side, offering guidance and support as Khalil came to terms with his newfound powers. The doctor had explained everything he could, about the ancient bloodline, the powers it entailed, and the people who would stop at nothing to unlock that power for themselves. But even with Dr. Green's help, Khalil couldn't shake the fear that had taken root in him. The fear that he wasn't ready. The fear that he was still the boy who had been abandoned, still the boy who didn't know how to belong. And then there was his family, his parents, who had reappeared after all these years. They had wanted to make things right, but could they really? Could they ever undo the damage of the past? And more importantly, could Khalil accept them as part of his life again? It had taken time for him to come to a decision, and he hadn't made it lightly. Forgiveness, he had realized, was not about erasing the pain of the past, it was about choosing to move forward. To let go of the anger that had consumed him for so long, and to accept that while his parents had made a terrible mistake, they were trying. They were doing the best they could now, and that was all anyone could ask for. Khalil stood up, walking slowly to the window and looking out at the horizon. The world seemed so much bigger than it had ever felt before. He could sense the energy of everything around him, feel the pulse of the earth, the people, the hidden forces that tugged at the edges of his awareness. It was overwhelming, and yet, it was his. He had spent so many years running from who he was, from the power inside him, from the truth about his origins. But the truth was simple: he was a part of this world, just as much as anyone else. He didn't have to hide, didn't have to fear the unknown. He could choose his path. And while the path ahead wasn't easy, it was his to walk. As he looked out at the world, Khalil finally understood the lesson that had been unfolding all along. It wasn't about what had happened to him. It wasn't about his appearance, or the mistakes his parents had made. It was about what he chose to become. The choices he made now would shape his future, would shape the world around him. The power he had, the abilities that seemed so unnatural, weren't just a burden. They were a gift. And it was up to him to decide what to do with them. Khalil could choose to hide from his legacy, to shy away from the responsibility that came with his power. Or he could embrace it, face the challenges ahead, and use his abilities for good. He could choose to protect the innocent, to fight against those who would use his power for selfish gain. In the end, Khalil realized that the most important thing was to embrace who he was, both the boy who had been abandoned and the man he was becoming. He didn't have to be defined by his past, but he could let it shape who he was today. He could forgive, and in doing so, he could free himself from the chains of resentment. He could move forward, knowing that no matter what happened, he had the power to shape his own destiny. The knock at the door was soft, but Khalil felt it in his bones. He turned to see his parents standing in the doorway, their faces filled with uncertainty but also hope. He could see the tears in his mother's eyes, the pain in his father's face, but also the love that had never truly disappeared. "Are you ready?" his mother asked softly. Khalil smiled, a smile that held the weight of everything he had learned in the past few days, the pain, the healing, the lessons. He nodded, his voice steady. "I am." And with that, Khalil stepped forward into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. With the power to change the world and the wisdom to know when to fight, and when to forgive, he would walk this new path, his path, without fear. For the first time in his life, Khalil was no longer running. He was ready to live.